This week on Jonny Builds, I built a modern style farmhouse table. A Parsons table to be more accurate. A Parsons table features legs pushed all the way out to the ends and flush with the top, and was designed almost 100 years ago to be a basic, lasting design, whether left unfinished, sheathed in gold, or in this case, inlaid epoxy and reclaimed wood. This table is built from a mixture of red and white Barnwood oak that is likely 50 to 100 years old. My friends at Vintage Reclaimed Lumber in Oklahoma City provided all the wood for this project, and they are the sponsors of this video. More on VRL later and down in the description below. As I pick out my boards, you can see the issues working with wood like this. None of these boards were straight, and many of them were cupped or twisted. For being such a simple design, this was one of the most challenging projects I've ever completed. Every step along the way was a learning experience, and I had a few setbacks along the way. The legs are made from this reclaimed beam that was almost 15 feet long. We brought the beam into the VRL shop to mill the legs, and the first step was to cut them down to 32-inch long sections. The beam was about 11 to 12 inches wide and about 5.5 inches tall, and as you see, I had to flip the beam over and make this cut in 2 passes. Using this giant medieval Tanowitz bandsaw, I resawed the leg blanks in half, and this is where I encountered my first hiccup. The blade was deflecting and preventing me from getting straight cuts. Now I managed to get the leg blanks resawn on the bandsaw, but that left a lot of cleanup work to be done to get them squared up. Next I ran the leg blanks through the joiner to get 2 flattened square surfaces. Then I had to use this 14-inch rip blade to cut the legs to their final width of 4¼ inches square. Back in my own shop, I laid out all the boards for the tabletop and measured out how much usable material I had in each one. I ended up with an alternating pattern of red and white oak boards for the tabletop, and then I could cut these boards down to a rough length of 90 inches long. This table is going to be 7 feet long, and this gives me a bit of wiggle room before cutting the tabletop to its final length. I ran all these boards through my joiner to get a flat edge, and then I cut them down to their final width of 5 inches over on the table saw. I started with the 5 boards that will make up the longer middle portion of the table, and I'm using dominoes to help with the alignment since the boards are a little bit warped. Probably more than I needed, but it helped pull these boards back into alignment. I added dominoes and glue to put these 2 boards together. Now it was a bit of a task to get these 2 boards to line up, but with a little bit of coaxing and a good wooden mallet, I was able to make it work. Once the glue had dried, I took the boards out of the clamps and I used my Stanley No. 5 jack plane to smooth out the bottom. And then I skip planed the boards to help flatten the top without losing too much of that character of the wood. I repeated this process for the remaining boards and then glued up all 5 planks that make up the long section of the tabletop, again using dominoes for alignment and to help pull everything together as straight as I could get it. With a bit more coaxing, I got the whole top in the clamps and added some caul boards wrapped in packing tape to the end to prevent further bowing. Once the top had dried, I flipped it over on my workbench and shimmed up the high spots. Now the idea here is to use a router sled to flatten the bottom as much as possible. Then I could flip the whole thing over and hit the top of the table, only removing the high spots and leaving all the character. With the longer section of the tabletop done, now I could add the 2 shorter boards to the ends that the legs will sit flush against. I sanded them down and used the legs to mark the exact width they needed to be, and then ripped them over on my table saw. I clamped the legs flush with the end of the table and used the leg on the other end to mark their length, which I cut over on the miter saw. I added dominoes to these boards and attached them to the longer portion of the table with some glue and a little bit of brute force clamping pressure to pull everything into alignment. I came back with my jack plane and also this little block plane to flush up this board and the seam to the rest of the tabletop. Moving on to the legs, the next step was to hit them with a belt sander and an 80 grit belt to remove most of the grit built up over the last 60 or so years. Once that was done, it was time to start pouring the epoxy inlays. I started with the tabletop and I used aluminum tape here to shore up the bottom of the table first. This is my first time to use this East Coast resin and I had really good results. I mixed equal parts resin and hardener and made sure it was thoroughly mixed before I added the blue, green, and white pearl pigments to get the depth of color I was going for. And now it was time to pour. As you can see here, my first pour on the tabletop was a bit sloppy and the uneven surface caused it to spread out a little bit. I got a bit more efficient with my pours, but I still had a lot of overflow that I had to address later. I also mixed some sawdust into a batch of epoxy and filled any of the small gaps where the boards connected. The legs had several large cracks that I decided to backfill with this Bondo fiberglass resin. It's much cheaper than the two-part epoxy I was using, but in hindsight I think I would have been better off just filling everything with the same pigmented resin. This caused some issues of having to chip away some of this resin that was showing through the pigmented resin later on. And once that had dried, I came back with the colored epoxy and filled it in over the Bondo resin. I wanted to leave some of the checks for aesthetic reasons, but some of the bigger cracks had to be addressed for stability. Also, a quick tip, don't use regular packing tape like I did here. It did not contain the epoxy well at all. I quickly switched back to using the aluminum tape. Also, these epoxy pours actually took several weeks to complete. I had multiple surfaces to fill, and often I would come back after the epoxy dried to find that it just flowed down into some unseen crack. After pouring the epoxy, I used a heat gun to pop any air bubbles, and then I came back to remove the overpour with a chisel after it dried. I also sanded down the resin, and it was here that I realized the sanding was heating up the resin and making it easier to chisel away. I tried using a heat gun and this worked great. This made my epoxy overpour removal go much faster and have a much cleaner result. I repeated this whole process all over again on the knots and cracks in the wood that I used for the aprons. And once all these numerous epoxy pours were done, I sanded the resin first with 600 grit sandpaper, then 1200 grit, and finally 2000 grit to get the shine that I was looking for. Now to begin assembling the tables, and this is where I ran into a lot of issues. I used a sheet of plywood on the flattest portion of my shop to have a good surface to reference the fit of the legs. I clamped the legs in place, added a few weights to keep the table from bowing up, and then marked the alignment of the legs. The aprons were cut oversized, and I used this setup to mark out their exact length of roughly 25 inches. I cut them to fit on the miter saw and then repeated this process for the other 3 aprons. I came up with these 45-degree rest and a drilling jig to mortise out a slot for diagonal braces to hold the legs to the apron, and spoiler, it did not work at all. The idea was to chisel out these mortises where a 45-degree angle that was going to hold the aprons could rest up against the leg, and then I would drill a lag bolt into the leg to secure everything. Having the legs held on only by a single bolt made them far too wobbly, and I had to remake the whole entire apron structure because I had already glued the battens in place. So back to the drawing board, I had to make all new aprons and rethink their connection to the legs. Again, I cut them to fit against the legs, but this time I marked out where the apron made it up to the legs. I cut in 2 dominoes to the end of each apron and matching dominoes on the legs themselves. Now I could dry fit the aprons and add the center stretcher and battens seen here, also using dominoes. I took the whole apron assembly apart and then reassembled it piece by piece, this time adding glue. The way I clamped up the table base without the tabletop in place caused some major issues. I'll explain more in a bit, but first you see me putting the tabletop in place and then marking out where I need to cut it flush with the legs, which I then did with my track saw. I added some dominoes to the aprons that are going to allow me to attach the tabletop with some tabletop buttons. And finally I can move on to the finish. I used this General Finishes satin water-based top coat. It's my first time to ever use this finish and I'm very pleased with the results. I put 4 coats on. I put in all the tabletop buttons and attached the tabletop, and that's when I discovered some issues with the fit. When I clamped up the apron structure to the legs, the uneven clamping pressure and the fact that none of the reclaimed wood is perfectly straight managed to pull the base out of alignment, and this left me with these gaps, and this table just did not meet my standards. This whole time I was building a second table in the background. I learned from those mistakes on the first table, fixed them on the second table, and I couldn't be more pleased with the results. I want to give a special thanks to the sponsor of this video, Vintage Reclaimed Lumber. If you're in the Oklahoma City area, make sure to check them out. They've got a great selection of reclaimed lumber, beautiful live edge slabs, and old timber beams. If you're not in the Oklahoma City area, check them out online at vrlumber.com. They do ship anywhere in the country. Just use the code Jonny10 for 10% off of your order. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you liked it, make sure to hit that thumbs up, and please subscribe. Thanks for checking this one out, and we'll see you back here next time.